According to Ambassador Freeman, MPEC reached about 13,000 teachers by 2002, and he estimated that works like the Arab World Studies Notebook reached about 1 million children a year. The notebook is produced by the Arab World and Islamic Resource, which was run by a woman by the name of Audrey Shabazz. AWARE received funds from Saudi Aramco in order to publish. Interestingly, Shabazz was actually on the payroll of the Mideast Policy Council in 2005, where she received $62,000 on top of the $40,000 salary she drew as compensation for her own organization. So the Arab World Studies Notebook is a good example of the kind of publishing that Saudi Aramco and other Saudi private sector organizations participate in. MPEC's goal in all of its activities, as Ambassador Freeman has admitted, is to influence American policy on the Middle East to a more pro-Arab position, although MPEC does vigorously oppose being called a lobby. Case study number 2, the Middle East Institute. The Middle East Institute is run by former Ambassador Edward Walker and former Ambassador Mike Fowler. The MEI has stated that about $200,000 of a $1.5 million budget came from Saudi sources in 2002. That represents about 13% of their total budget. And MEI spokesmen, particularly the ambassadors such as Walker and Fowler, routinely appear on the news and in print and in op-eds as frequent experts on Saudi Arabia, defending their human rights records and minimizing Wahhabist extremism that comes out of the kingdom or connections between Saudi Arabia and terrorism. As an example, for instance, in 2002, Mike Fowler insisted that Saudi Wahhabism, quote, does teach tolerance for Jews and Christians, despite all the evidence to the contrary that Professor Kadar gave us earlier. And they have also claimed, for instance, that democracy is right around the corner in Saudi Arabia, with Edward Walker saying, and I quote, I spoke to a senior Saudi prince the other day, and he was talking about this very problem, and he said that he would be willing to bet that within 10 years they will have free elections in Saudi Arabia. And that's a pretty profound statement for somebody in the ruling family, unquote. It is a profound statement. It was also made more than 10 years ago. So as you can see, there's still no free elections in Saudi Arabia. Case study number 3, the Americans for Middle East Understanding. It's run by former ambassador to Saudi Arabia James Akins and former Congressman Paul Findley. Received about $50,000 to $60,000 a year from Saudi Aramco, and publishes a very anti-Israel publication called The Link, which goes to schools, libraries, churches, and academics. It's also received funds from the Oleon Charitable Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Oleon Group, a Saudi multinational. On their website, they sell 70 books and 16 videotapes. Of the 70 books for sale, 50 of them are related to Israel's occupation, a negative portrayal of Zionism, or the quote-unquote Israel lobby, and 4 of them regard America's war in Iraq. Of the videos available for sale, 16 of them are about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Findley and Atkins are interesting because they were involved in a lawsuit against the Federal Election Commission claiming that the FEC had refused to penalize AIPAC over alleged campaign finance infractions. So again, this all goes back to the idea that there needs to be an effort to take on the pro-Israel lobby and the hostile media campaign which it generates that was mentioned at the 2004 conference. So far I've mentioned what are basically think tank style organizations that work to influence opinion and policy through the media and through policymakers themselves, but the Saudis also fund organizations whose focus, you could say, is of the creation of an ethnic constituency, an Arab American constituency. And this work seems to be seen by the Saudis as an effort to counter what they view to be the pro-Israel lobby, since they believe that U.S. policy comes primarily out of a product of politically active Jewish voters. So their attempt to create a similar organization of their own. So that was case study number 4, includes the Arab American Institute and the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. The Arab American Institute is headed by James Zogby, whose name you may recognize. Its primary concerns, according to their 2008 congressional scorecard, were the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Iraq War, and allegations of civil rights abuses in the war on terror. They'd received funds from the Saudi Oleon Charitable Fund. They'd worked alongside Hamas-linked CARE in civil rights conferences in 2000. And James Bogby is also the secretary for the Arab World and Islamic Resource, which publishes the Arab World Studies Notebook. And he, in fact, wrote an article defending the notebook when it was challenged for some of its contents without ever disclosing his own affiliation with the organization that produced it. According to author Stephen Schwartz in the New York Post, Zogby traveled to Riyadh in 2003, where acting as an AAI representative, he spoke with the Secretary of the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, which is an arm of the Saudi government responsible for propagating Wahhabist Islam around the world. The two organizations announced that they would work together to fight the deportations of up to 13,000 Arabs and Muslims from the United States. And this is of interest because at the time, there was quite a lot of talk in the press about how a proactive immigration enforcement was an important element of the anti-terror efforts at the time. AAI's chairman, George Salam, received $70,000 in lobbying work from Saudi-registered foreign agent DLA Piper, and he had also worked for another Saudi-registered agent, Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Field. And this is interesting because he's also a board member of the other organization I wanted to mention, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. Now, the ADC opposes almost all anti-terror legislation. Its communication director, Hussein Abish, supported convicted Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organizer Sami al-Arni, calling his investigation and arrest, quote, McCarthyism. Its founder, former Senator James Aberzek, has called Hezbollah's actions during the Second Lebanon War, quote, exemplary, and the ADC called Hamas and Hezbollah as being recognized as, quote, resistance fighters and freedom fighters. Now, for these strong stances, they were well rewarded by the Saudis, receiving $6 million for a building from Prince Alwaleed bin Talal in 2005. The ADC also received $20,000 for a research institute from the Oleon Charitable Trust in 2006 and 2007. The ADC does work in conjunction with other Saudi-supported organizations. They participated in that FEC trial, which I mentioned, where their president at the time, Abedin Jabara, served as co-counsel. And it's interesting because Jabara was also co-counsel in the Omar Abdel Rothman terror trial and was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Lynn Stewart Material Support for Terrorism trial. Now, if these NGOs that I mentioned and the numerous ones like them that are out there operated by themselves, whether they received Saudi funding or not, I don't think they'd be as effective as they are, except they're backed up by high-powered public relations firms which also receive Saudi money. And this gives them an added reach which other NGOs and think tanks wouldn't be able to match. And this is all part of the Saudi effort to counter the quote-unquote hostile media campaign. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about one particular PR firm, Corvus Communications. Now, Corvus had provided a long list of services to the Saudis, including arranging media appearances, organizing conferences, and coordinating outreach events for which they were paid rather handsomely. They received $14 million a year at one point and received still over $1 million in 2008. So I'd like to present two case studies where there are strong allegations that Corvus, together with Saudi-funded NGOs, engaged in deceptive tactics to promote Saudi Arabia's interests. In 2002, a hastily organized group of NGOs, which called themselves the Alliance for Peace and Justice, and it included the ADC and the Middle East Policy Council, among some others, began running advertisement in favor of the Saudi peace plan and condemning Israeli military action. Now, as it turned out, the alliance happened to share the exact same address on all of their filings as Corvus Communications. And the ads were produced by Corvus Communications, for which the alliance paid them $700,000. So the question is, where does an ad hoc task force of NGOs come up with $700,000 for a single ad campaign? And the answer is they got a bridge loan from the Saudi embassy. But loan is probably the wrong word because the Saudi spokesman at the time, a man named Adel al-Jubair, who was later promoted to ambassador, agreed to go to Saudi Arabia and fundraise to come up with the money to pay back the loan that the Saudis gave the organizations to begin with so that they could pay Corvus, which was a registered foreign agent of the Saudis. The second case that I'd like to report to you was first mentioned by Daniel Pipes. It's the case of a man named Charles Lipson, who was a professor at the University of Chicago and ran a speaker panel type program. In 2004, he was contacted by Adelson and Associates, which is a local PR firm that was on subcontract from Corvus. And the PR firm told Lipson that they had 5 speakers who would like to talk about the Middle East, including 2 former ambassadors, Walter Cutler of the Meridian Center and Richard Murphy of the Middle East Institute, which I mentioned earlier. And the PR spokeswoman told Lipson all 5 speakers were, and I quote, allies of Saudi Arabia. After Lipson expressed some concern that perhaps he wouldn't be able to afford the honorarium for 2 ambassadors, he was told not to worry and that all expenses will be covered by the PR firm. Now, when this was made public, both Corvus and the Saudi embassy attempted to deny that they had any intention of covering the cost of the speakers, but either these ambassadors were flying out to Chicago for free or somebody was paying for it. In conclusion, I think it's fair to state that the 2004 Riyadh Conference image of Saudi Arabia in the world does indeed reflect the sort of planned effort by Saudi Arabia to engage in influence operations against the United States. Further, I think you can say that the manner in which the Saudi government organs, its royal family members, and various influential quasi-public entities such as Saudi Aramco dispense funds to American organizations is in a manner consistent with promoting the objectives of that operation. So what is the end goal of the operation? I would argue that the goal is to prevent us from understanding the enemy and their objectives. It distracts policymakers and the general public from understanding the reality of the confrontation with Islamists supported by Saudi Arabia, whether violent terrorists like al-Qaeda or pre-violent groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood. It disguises the Saudi role in spreading Wahhabist ideology worldwide, and it helps conceal their objectives of the enemy, namely the defeat of the United States, the imposition of Sharia, and particularly a strict Wahhabist interpretation, and throughout the world. So how does that affect us? Well, consider, for example, the homegrown terror threat that exists. It becomes very difficult to analyze that threat if you understand the objectives of the enemy as being solely ones of foreign policy objections. For instance, that they are concerned about U.S. support for Israel or U.S. bases in the Middle East, that sort of thing. But if you understand it as primarily an ideological conflict, then you have certain facts which you have to consider. For example, according to the Council on American Islamic Relations in 2002, and they're a Muslim Brotherhood front group, but this is what they said. 70 to 80% of American mosques in 2002 they reported to be Wahhabist. And you just heard Professor Kadar talk about their study on American mosques, where 82 out of 100 surveyed mosques featured imams which recommended texts which contained violent passages. So it's interesting how well those two numbers track out together. But then where can we go to have military officers and policymakers and staffers educated about the ideology which is spawning the threat to the United States when Saudi Arabia is spending so much money and so much effort to convince them of the opposite? And what does this lead to? Well, it leads to things like having administration officials like John Brennan campaign very heavily to prevent law enforcement and intelligence officials use the proper terms for discussing the enemy. Don't use the term jihad. Don't use the term mujahideen, for example. And if you can't understand the enemy, it becomes very difficult to fight him. And that's why we hear stories about Yemeni al-Qaeda cleric Anwar al-Awlaki giving sermons on Capitol Hill or eating lunch at the Pentagon, which he did just months after 9/11. It's why you have Muslim Brotherhood operatives like Kipa Mustafa, an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, attending tours of the National Counterterrorism Center. Similarly, not just domestically, but in foreign policy, it affects our ability to act effectively. It leads us into seeing moderates where they do not exist among terrorist organizations such as the Taliban, Hezbollah, and Hamas. If you believe that the primary concern is the Israel issue or the bases issue in the Middle East, then you think that there's some elements that can be negotiated. You think that there is a political wing that can be talked to, but there's not. So influence operations like this are very difficult to respond to in a free and open society like ours. In the case of the Russian illegals, which I mentioned, it was broken up by the FBI because they were engaging in typical espionage tactics. They practiced secret writing. They had dead drops. They engaged in money laundering, these sorts of things. Similarly, in the case of the 2 U.S. citizens working on behalf of the ISI out of Pakistan, you had the active and apparent involvement of a foreign intelligence service. So there, counterintelligence officials in our country can build legal cases through your standard counterintelligence methods. But how do you respond when a foreign government has established what amounts to a legal influence operation. Foreign donations to nonprofit organizations are not illegal. There's no requirement for a nonprofit to reveal its source of funding, either domestic or foreign. And in any case, the individuals that I mentioned are, for the most part, American citizens, some of them quite influential American citizens, and they're engaging in activities which are protected by the First Amendment. But that said, the Foreign Agent Registration Act was explicitly created to deal with propaganda efforts to reach out to the public during World War II against what the Nazis were doing. And nonprofit organizations have no immunity from filing as a foreign registered agent if they're engaging in political or public relations activities for the interest of or in the pay of a foreign principal. But in practice, there's been no successful FARA prosecutions since 1966, and the burden of proof in such cases has become all but insurmountable. And in any case, the FARA unit of the FBI is deeply underfunded.